Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different, and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1, Where the Garden Still Breathes. 3 mornings ago, something unfamiliar waited beneath her mailbox. No stamp, no name, just a small parcel wrapped in thin paper as if handled with care. Inside lay an old brass key, dulled by time, and a short message written in a hand that made her pulse stumble. It's time to return. The garden is calling. Iris read those words again and again, her fingers trembling. The handwriting stirred a memory she couldn't fully grasp, steady, patient strokes that belonged to someone she had buried years ago. She remembered standing beside an open grave, remembered the finality of it, and yet here she was, staring at proof that contradicted everything she knew. She lifted the key toward the window. Sunlight slid across its worn teeth, and something inside her chest tightened. Not fear, not confusion, longing. Sudden and overwhelming, like homesickness for a place she hadn't realized she'd lost. The old house rose in her mind without effort. The wide porch that creaked under bare feet, vines curling along white railings, soil-stained hands guiding hers as she learned which green shoots were worth saving and which needed pulling. She hadn't planned to leave the city that day, but by evening she was on the road, following an urge that refused to be reasoned with. The drive unfolded like a memory replaying itself. Streets lined with mature trees, lawns trimmed too neatly, sprinklers clicking in slow, familiar rhythms. She turned corners without checking signs, guided by something deeper than thought. When she reached Elm Street, there was no doubt she was exactly where she needed to be. Then she saw the garden and stopped breathing. It shouldn't have existed like this. Not now, not after years of neglect. And yet color exploded from every corner. Roses climbed high, heavy with blooms in shades so rich they looked unreal. Large flowers swayed gently, proud and full as if tended daily. Near the kitchen window, herbs released their scent into the cooling air, sharp and comforting all at once. It was unchanged, not preserved alive, as though time itself had stepped aside. Her first reaction was disbelief, almost anger. Gardens didn't behave this way, not in autumn, not without care. And yet every path, every bed matched the summers of her childhood, when a calm voice beside her named each plant like a promise. She unlocked the front door. The key moved smoothly, obediently, like it had been waiting. Inside, the house held her in a quiet stillness that felt intimate rather than empty. Objects rested exactly where memory said they should be. Glasses folded beside old newsprint, a familiar pouch on the mantel. When she inhaled, she caught a trace of a scent she thought she'd never encounter again. Sweet, warm, unmistakable. The place felt occupied, not abandoned, as if someone had simply stepped into the next room. And standing there, surrounded by echoes that refused to fade, Iris understood something unsettling and gentle at once. Some things don't die. They wait. The house didn't feel empty. It felt full, as though every step stirred the weight of lives once lived so intensely they had never truly left. Iris moved carefully from room to room, her phone's flashlight cutting narrow paths through the dimness. She didn't try the light switches. Something about this place made modern conveniences feel intrusive, like breaking a rule she didn't remember agreeing to. She brewed tea the old way, bottled water from her car, a small camping burner she kept buried in the trunk, a leftover from trips she vaguely recalled taking with parents whose faces grew softer and less defined each time she reached for them. She poured the hot water into one of her grandmother's cups, porcelain thin, painted in blue and white curves that fit her palms perfectly. She noticed the tiny chip along the saucer's edge. She remembered that chip, remembered being warned about it. For a fleeting moment, she could almost see swollen fingers curled around the handle, could almost hear a gentle voice cautioning her to be careful, explaining that it was precious, older than it looked. The thought stopped her cold. Had her grandmother ever spoken about her own mother? Iris stood there, cup hovering inches from her lips, her mind searching. Summers blurred together, long afternoons in the garden, warm kitchens, familiar routines, but stories, names, anything before this house, before these walls and soil and roses. Nothing surfaced. The tea tasted strangely flat, as if warmth without flavor. She set the cup down untouched and drifted toward the kitchen window. Outside, the roses glowed faintly in the twilight, vibrant in a season they shouldn't have survived. The ordinariness of the moment, standing at the sink, holding a cup, watching the garden, should have soothed her. Instead, it felt rehearsed, like she'd stepped into a role she knew by heart without ever learning the script. A sudden thought struck her. She should call her mother, let her know she'd arrived. She unlocked her phone, relief already forming, and scrolled. No parents. She scrolled again, slower this time. Then faster, coworkers, services, old numbers she barely recognized. A restaurant she ordered from too often, but no family, her chest tight. She tried to remember the number herself. Digits floated up, almost right, almost familiar, but they wouldn't hold together. They shifted, rearranged, dissolved. She could hear her mother's voice clearly in her head, could picture the warmth of it greeting her. But when Iris tried to anchor that voice to a real conversation, a real moment, it slipped away, leaving only the echo. She told herself it was exhaustion, grief, the mind protecting itself by blurring the edges of pain. Still, the unease lingered, sharp and persistent. Back in her city apartment, she had a desk cluttered with papers and unopened mail. There had to be proof there. A card, a photograph, something tangible, something real. She turned back to the window, watching the garden breathe in the dusk, and for the first time, the thought crept in, quiet but terrifying. What if the house was the only thing that had ever truly remembered her? The flowers outside the window leaned and lifted with the evening air, their movement slow and deliberate, almost as if guided by an unseen rhythm. Iris watched, transfixed. Then she saw it, a shape slipping between the rose bushes. Too tall, too steady. It moved with intent, not chance. Instead of fear, a quiet smile touched her lips, even as a chill traced her spine. Still keeping watch, she whispered, addressing no one. The explanations had begun when she was small. 7, maybe 8. Every family wrapped mysteries in gentle stories. Why did her grandfather's garden thrive when others failed? Why did pests avoid his beds? Why did the roses lean toward him as he passed, blooming long after they should have withered? The answer was always the same. He had a gift, a rare touch, an understanding others lacked. As years passed, those answers softened into legend. They said he never truly left, that something of him stayed rooted in the soil. Her grandmother spoke of seeing him in the morning haze, bent over the beds, tending with the same patient precision. She spoke of familiar scents drifting through open windows at night, warm and sweet, mingling with flowers that only bloomed in darkness. Back then, Iris had found comfort in it. Death was supposed to end things cleanly, but if devotion could reach beyond it, if love could anchor itself to the living world, then perhaps goodbye wasn't as final as people claimed. standing now in the kitchen where she'd once worked side by side with her grandmother, snapping beans and laughing softly. That comfort twisted into something uneasy. The garden outside wasn't just healthy, it was exact. Every vine trained just so, every herb spaced with unmistakable intention. No hired hand could have recreated this. No schedule or service could mimic the quiet artistry she recognized down to her bones. She lifted her suitcase and headed upstairs. Near the bottom of the staircase, she faltered, her shoulder brushing the thick wooden post of the banister. The sensation made her pause. It felt dulled, like touching something through layers of fabric. The post stood solid, unmoved, yet it was as if she barely connected with it at all. She frowned, shaking her head. Fatigued, she told herself. The day had been longer than she thought. Her bedroom awaited her unchanged. The quilt lay folded across the bed, its colors faded by years of washing. Books rested on the nightstand exactly where she remembered leaving them. She slipped beneath the covers and stared at the ceiling, listening as the house breathed and shifted around her. Every creak was familiar. Every whisper carried a strangeness she couldn't name. Sometime after midnight, a sound reached her ears. Footsteps, slow, measured, moving along the garden path outside. The footsteps stopped with purpose, the kind that belonged to someone who knew the land by heart. Iris froze. She leaned forward, breath caught in her throat, pressing her cheek to the cool glass. Through the thin curtains, moonlight washed the garden in pale silver. At first there was only stillness, straight lines of soil, gravel paths, quiet order, then movement. A figure stepped into view. Tall, slightly bent at the shoulders, moving slowly, deliberately, as if every step mattered. He passed between the beds with careful attention, pausing beside each plant. Even in shadow, even half obscured by darkness and disbelief, recognition struck her like a pulse. The pause, the measured pace, the faint hitch in his stride, the limp that had appeared years ago after surgery and never fully faded. Her grandfather. He moved through the garden the way he always had, inspecting leaves, brushing soil aside, lingering just long enough before moving on. Iris watched, unable to blink, afraid the image would shatter if she did. When the figure slipped back into the darker edge of the yard near the compost bins and vanished, she sank onto the bed, her heart pounding. What she felt wasn't terror. It was reassurance. The stories weren't lies. He hadn't left. He was still here, tending what he loved. The realization should have unsettled her, but instead it settled something deep inside her chest. It felt familiar. It felt right. The days that followed slipped into a routine that soothed and disturbed her in equal measure. Mornings began at the kitchen table, coffee warming her hands as sunlight spilled over the garden. Afternoons passed quietly, curled into her grandmother's chair with a book she barely remembered choosing. Evenings unfolded on the porch as the air filled with soft fragrance and the hum of night. Everything flowed effortlessly, too effortlessly. Her hands moved before her thoughts did. She reached for items without searching, knew exactly where everything belonged. Filters in the upper cabinet, sugar tucked away where no guest would think to look. The mug placed on the counter in the same spot it had always rested. These weren't habits she remembered learning. They surfaced whole, complete, as if they'd been waiting. It didn't feel like memory. It felt like inheritance. During the week, she returned to the city for work, but the place no longer held weight. Her apartment felt thin, like scenery instead of shelter. Her desk, her screens, even the people around her seemed distant, as though she were watching someone else's life from behind glass. Conversations blurred, Faces felt unfamiliar. When her supervisor casually asked about her plans for the weekend, Iris answered without hesitation, "I'm visiting family." The words left her mouth before she realized she'd spoken them, and once they did, they felt undeniably true. Every weekend, the pull grew stronger. Elm Street wasn't just a destination, it was a gravity well, drawing her back with a force she couldn't resist. Each visit, the house revealed itself a little more, as if it had been waiting for her to notice, to remember. In the pantry, a loose floorboard shifted under her fingers to reveal a small tin filled with postcards, stunning vistas of mountains and canyons, signed in unfamiliar names, in handwriting that carried no meaning for her. Behind the linen closet, beneath stacks of meticulously folded sheets, she discovered a shoebox. Inside were delicate trinkets, brooches, earrings, even a man's pocket watch frozen at 11:47. Each find should have felt like an archaeological dig, the careful excavation of lives long gone. But instead, it was as though she were recovering her own lost memories, uncovering fragments she had buried somewhere deep in herself, rather than exploring a house supposedly empty for decades. Then, on her third weekend, something changed. She was searching for extra blankets in the hall closet when her fingers brushed a narrow gap in the back wall. Pressing against it, a panel swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. There lay a leather-bound journal, its pages covered in the same meticulous handwriting she had seen in her grandfather's gardening notes. But these weren't records of plants or soil. These were records of people. October 15th, 1962. The traveling salesman stopped for directions. Late evening, no witnesses. Broad shoulders. Will be perfect for the deep roots of the new rose bed. December 3rd, 1963. Young woman hitchhiking north on Highway 101, claiming to start over in Oregon. Helped her start over differently. Vitality sufficient for next season's dahlias. March 22nd, 1965. Drifter sleeping in the park. No identification. No family. Added to compost area. Tomatoes thriving. Page after page chronicled lives ended and folded into the garden, each carefully noted, measured, repurposed. The language was clinical, detached, almost proud in its precision. Her stomach churned, the air thick with disbelief and nausea. And yet beneath the horror, a deeper terror settled in. She recognized the words, not from yesterday, not as an adult, but as a child sitting in her grandfather's study, turning the pages of his books, fascinated, unaware, absorbing the rhythm and order of something she could not yet understand. It wasn't just a house she had returned to. It was a memory she had lived, and now finally remembered. At first, Iris had thought the journal was nothing more than another gardening notebook, another relic of her grandfather's meticulous habits. She remembered flipping through pages as a child, asking him about compost, about how scraps of life returned to the earth to feed new growth. His explanations had been gentle, comforting, wrapped in patience. Those memories were vivid, tangible, and yet now utterly impossible, because she knew with absolute certainty she was not alone in the house. It began subtly. A coffee cup appeared on the counter when she didn't remember making tea. Books shifted slightly on shelves. The thermostat hummed to the precise temperature her grandfather had always preferred. Then came the dirt, rich, dark, alive, trailing from the back door to the hall closet where his tools were stored. Footprints pressed into the mat, unbroken, deliberate. Any reasonable person would have panicked, changed the locks, called for help. But Iris didn't need logic. She had grown up here. She knew the steps belonged to him. Outside, the garden thrived with a vitality that defied reason. November came. and while the rest of Elm Street lay dormant in shades of brown, the roses exploded in impossible color. Pumpkins and winter squash glowed orange against the dark soil like lanterns. Neighbors drifted over, drawn to the spectacle, their voices a mix of awe and disbelief. "What's your secret?" Helen Chang asked one evening, pointing to the towering wall of climbing roses. Her tone carried suspicion and confusion. "I've lived here 40 years, and that house has been empty the whole time. Then you appear, and suddenly it's like 1960 again." Iris felt a chill she couldn't explain. "My grandparents," she began, but Helen interrupted, shaking her head. "There haven't been any grandparents, honey. The old man died when I was 12. My mother told me he was a strange fellow, kept to himself. The house has been vacant ever since." Helen's eyes softened with concern. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." After Helen left, Iris wandered through the garden alone, trying to see it through another's eyes. The roses were undeniably beautiful, but now something deeper unsettled her. They grew in dense, impenetrable clusters, thorns sharper than necessary, soil so dark it seemed almost liquid under the fading light. She realized she had never seen insects among the flowers. No bees, no beetles, nothing. The garden was alive in ways that obeyed no natural rules, cultivated not just by hands, but by something else. And as she ran her fingers along a rose stem, feeling the strange pulse of life beneath the thorns, she understood. This was no ordinary garden. It had a guardian, and she was finally beginning to see who. The garden moved with a life of its own. Every leaf and petal seemed untouched by rot, untouched by disease, as though the air around it formed a protective bubble, impervious to the outside world. But there was something else, something in the scent that prickled her senses. Beneath the familiar perfume of roses and herbs, a sharp metallic note lingered, undercut by a sickly sweetness that reminded her of meat left too long in summer heat. The smell was faint, almost imperceptible, yet once she noticed it, she couldn't stop analyzing it, inhaling it, letting it settle at the back of her throat with a rising knot of unease. That morning, the bathroom mirror unsettled her even more. Iris stared at her reflection, trying to pinpoint what felt off. Her face seemed less solid, less defined, as though light passed through her instead of bouncing off. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and normal. Stress, grief, she told herself. It had to be. Gardens smelled of earth and decay. That was the natural order. Life fed death, death fed life, just as her grandfather had always explained. Still, she began to spend less time among the beds. She lingered instead on the screen porch at a safe remove, watching without touching. She couldn't ignore the roses' strange texture, petals thick, almost fleshy, their red so vivid it felt unnervingly organic, almost human. And every night without fail, the figure returned. He moved through the rows with a quiet authority, hands brushing leaves as though greeting old friends. He never looked toward the house, never acknowledged her presence. Yet she knew he sensed her watching. On still nights, when the jasmine scent thickened the air and something darker lurked beneath it, she could hear him. Soft footsteps over gravel, a low murmur to the plants. The words were unintelligible, yet the rhythm, the cadence, struck a chord deep inside her. Her grandfather's voice, speaking to his garden as others speak to children or beloved animals, tender, patient, eternal. December brought unseasonable warmth. The roses responded with reckless brilliance, blooming more vividly than ever. Iris felt self-conscious about the spectacle, aware of neighbors slowing their cars, whispering, staring. And still, the figure moved among the blooms, invisible yet undeniably present, as though the garden and everything in it belonged to him alone. Strangers were showing up more often now, slipping up the driveway with cameras in hand, murmuring admiration at the explosion of color and life in the garden. It was becoming a spectacle, a curiosity, and Iris felt a tug of unease. This had been her grandfather's sanctuary, a world of careful order and quiet devotion. Was she betraying it by letting outsiders marvel at his legacy? She might consider opening it for tour, said Mrs. Patterson from the local historical society when Iris had called about including the property in their spring showcase. People would pay to see this. Iris nodded, words automatic. Yes, he was extraordinary. But a creeping question nagged at her. Extraordinary how? She realized she actually knew very little about her grandfather's life beyond the garden. How had he learned his craft? Had he studied plants formally, trained under someone else? Or was this instinct honed in solitude? Family stories spoke only of results, of roses that climbed impossibly high, of vegetables that thrived when neighbors' gardens wilted. Methods, processes, origins, all were absent. Compelled by curiosity, Iris began examining the house with renewed attention. Her grandfather's study, once untouchable, revealed itself in fragments. Rows of books on botany and horticulture lined the shelves, filled with dense notes, sketches, and observations. But there were gaps, volumes missing. Spaces where pages had vanished. Behind a thick tome on soil composition, she discovered a manila folder. Inside, yellowed newspaper clippings tumbled into her lap, their headlines tightening her chest. Local woman vanishes on evening walk. Traveling salesman disappears. Search ongoing. Abandoned car found at highway rest stop. The dates span decades from the 1940s through the 1960s, all within 50 miles of San Jose. All involved strangers, drifters, loners, people who weren't missed immediately or perhaps ever. Iris sank into her grandfather's leather chair, the clippings spilling across the desk like shards of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps he'd been fascinated by local history, a hobbyist chronicling unexplained events. Maybe criminology intrigued him. Perhaps a book had been planned, a theory he'd meant to test but never finished. But rationalizations collided with memories. The parts of the garden he forbade her to enter. The tool shed locked and painted over, windows obscured. Every precaution, every restriction began to feel deliberate, purposeful, as though shielding more than just plants. Her pulse quickened. Something had always been hidden here, and now, for the first time, it was nudging its way into the open. The compost bins surfaced again in her thoughts, the ones he alone had tended, guarding them with quiet authority, never allowing another set of hands near them. And the soil, that impossibly dark, fertile soil that made everything explode with life far beyond what nature should allow. That night, Iris didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the garden as if seeing it for the first time. When the familiar figure finally appeared, slipping out of the shadows, the warmth she once felt was gone. She noticed how he didn't wander aimlessly. He moved with purpose, stopping only where the earth was darkest, richest. He crouched, inspected, lingered, like someone checking assets, not plants. The next morning, she drove straight to the library. Hours vanished in the dim glow of the microfilm room. Her fingers trembled as she printed article after article, police reports stacked beside her like evidence in a trial no one had ever held. Once the pattern emerged, it was impossible to ignore. Missing persons, again and again, always nearby, always people who drifted through life unnoticed, runaways, transients, loners, investigations half-hearted, cases quietly closed. No one had ever connected them to the quiet man on Elm Street with the miraculous garden. That evening, when Iris returned, Helen Chang was in her yard, trimming roses that looked pale and sick beside the riot of color next door. "I've been thinking about what you said," Iris called out, approaching the fence. "About the house being empty." Helen straightened, concern crossing her face. "I didn't mean to upset you. You seemed shaken." "I need to understand," Iris pressed. "You're certain no one's lived there since you moved in? 40 years. "Yes," Helen said gently but firmly. "The garden service comes once a week, always has, but no one lives there." She studied Iris closely. "Are you feeling okay, dear? Maybe you should talk to someone, a doctor, or look into the man who lived there before Arthur Quo." The name landed heavily. "What do you remember about him?" Iris asked. Helen hesitated. "My mother told stories, said he was odd, kept to himself, never married, spent all his time in that garden." She lowered her voice. "She said he scared her, not because of anything he did, just the way he looked at people, like he was measuring them." As the sun sank, the garden behind Iris burned with color, every bloom flawless, deliberate, almost excessive, beautiful in a way that felt wrong. That night, Iris sat alone at the kitchen table. The leather journal lay open before her, illuminated by the stark glow of a battery lantern. Shadows stretched across the walls as she turned the pages. Each entry was dated, precise, careful. Together, they didn't read like madness. They read like a system. Together, the entries formed something far worse than a collection of dark thoughts. They outlined a pattern, cold, deliberate, and repeated over decades. Lives taken not in rage, not in chaos, but with purpose. A harvest. Human bodies reduced to nourishment for a garden that should never have existed. Yet the detail that shattered her came later. The handwriting changed. At first, the script was exactly as she remembered from childhood. Measured, patient, every letter shaped with care. Her grandfather's hand. But as the years advanced, the writing grew more decorative, more fluid, almost expressive. And in the final pages, dated just before his recorded death in 1973, the handwriting was unmistakably familiar. It was hers. Iris lifted her hand, holding it beside the open journal. She compared the slant of the letters, the way certain loops curved, the pressure points where the pen would have paused. There was no denying it. The resemblance wasn't close. It was exact. A sound outside broke her trance. Footsteps, but wrong. Not the calm, methodical packing she'd come to expect. These steps were hurried, irregular, moving back and forth as if whoever walked the garden was unsettled, searching. She snapped the journal shut and crossed to the window. Moonlight spilled over the beds, and there he was, the familiar figure, tall and bent, but no longer tending. He was circling the perimeter now, scanning the rows, guarding them like something precious had been disturbed. When he turned toward the house, Iris recoiled from the glass, her heart slamming against her ribs. For a split second, she was certain his face tilted upward toward her window, watching. A look crossed his features, something between recognition and expectation. She didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the journal before her like a verdict already passed. Afraid to look outside, afraid to close her eyes, afraid to consider what it meant that her handwriting appeared in records written before she was ever born. Before sunrise, she fled. The drive back to the city blurred past her, questions spiraling without answers. The journal rode in the passenger seat, heavy and accusing, its pages filled with truths that didn't belong in any version of reality she understood. For 2 weeks, she pretended everything was normal. She went to work, paid bills, nodded through conversations about mundane plans and forgettable shows, but the world felt thin like scenery painted onto a stage. Every smile felt rehearsed, every interaction hollow. When she finally returned to Elm Street, it wasn't out of courage. It was desperation. She couldn't live inside the uncertainty anymore. She needed the truth, no matter how completely it dismantled the person she believed herself to be. And the garden was waiting. But something was wrong. The roses had gone feral. Their thorned limbs clawed across the walkways, knotting together with nearby shrubs until the paths were no longer paths at all, just barricades of living barbs. The vegetable beds were gone, overturned into raw stretches of soil that looked recently churned, as if the ground itself had been restless. And at the far edge of the property, where her grandfather once guarded his most treasured plants, fresh earth waited. Someone had started digging. The pit was deep, nearly 3 feet. Its edges were straight, deliberate, unnervingly precise. Iris felt the cold realization settle into her bones before her mind could fully catch up. The dimensions weren't random. They were human. She stepped closer, peering into soil so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it. And in that moment, understanding struck her with brutal clarity. This was what the garden had always been feeding on. What lay beneath the beauty, beneath the abundance, beneath the impossible blooms her grandfather had nurtured for decades. Her phone was already in her hand. She didn't remember deciding to call. Her fingers moved on their own, dialing 911 as her thoughts fractured into panic and dreadful certainty. She had been sleeping above this place for months. Above them. 911, what's your emergency? I need to report, her voice caught. She stared into the open grave, yawning at her feet like a silent invitation. I need to report a crime. Multiple crimes. There are bodies buried in my grandfather's garden. The words sounded unreal, but once spoken, they became solid, permanent. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Flashing lights flooded the quiet street as the garden transformed into a crime scene. Officer Gomez was gentle but methodical, taking her statement while others examined the property with a focus that made her stomach churn. When did your grandfather pass away, Miss Quo? He asked. Quo, Iris blinked. That's not my name, I'm Iris Sterling. My grandparents were Walter and Irene Sterling. Officer Gomez frowned at his clipboard. According to property records, this house belongs to an Arthur Quo, purchased in 1943. No additional names on the deed. The world tilted. Iris grabbed the porch railing, fighting the sudden weakness in her legs. Nothing fit. Not the name, not the date, not the certainty in his voice. That's impossible, she whispered. I inherited this house from my grandmother. She lived here with my grandfather for 60 years, Walter Sterling. He was a gardener. Even as she spoke, memories shifted uneasily. The way her parents had always avoided questions about her grandparents, the absence of wedding photos, the stories that never quite connected. And for the first time, Iris wondered if the garden hadn't just been hiding bodies. Maybe it had been hiding the truth. There were no photo albums, no birth certificates tucked into drawers, none of the quiet proof families leave behind to say, we existed here. Even the neighbors had stared when she arrived, their polite smiles stiff, their questions hesitant, like they were watching a stranger unlock a door that didn't belong to her. I think there may be a misunderstanding. The sentence never finished. A shout ripped through the night air from the garden. One of the technicians stood frozen at the edge of the pit, face drained of color under the blinding work lights. His voice shook when he spoke. "You need to come see this." They uncovered the first body 4 feet down. It had been wrapped once carefully in heavy canvas, now dissolved into threads by time and soil. The skeleton lay intact, still dressed. A thick wool coat, leather shoes, a rust-eaten watch locked around the wrist as if time itself had stopped with him. Male, middle-aged. The clothing placed his burial somewhere in the mid-20th century. Then they found another. 3 feet to the side, same careful depth, same preservation, then another, and another. As the digging spread outward, the garden's symmetry revealed its secret. Those neat beds, those perfect rows, it hadn't been artistry. It had been planning, a precise, patient design. Arthur Quill. Not Walter Sterling. Never Walter Sterling. By dawn, they had counted 23 bodies. 23 lives erased over 30 years, each laid to rest beneath soil that had gone on to grow award-winning roses. Beauty fed by disappearance. Iris sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket she didn't remember accepting, watching the investigation churn her world into pieces. It felt as though they weren't just digging up the garden. They were digging up her. A detective with hollow eyes and a creased jacket approached. His name badge read Hayes. "Miss," he said gently, "I need to understand how you came to be here. You are Iris Quo, correct?" Her heart stuttered. "No, I'm Iris Sterling. My grandparents were Walter and Irene Sterling. This was their home." He studied her for a moment, then opened the file. "According to every record we've checked, this property has belonged to Arthur Quo since 1943. There's no trace of anyone else ever owning it." "That's not possible," she said, her voice barely holding together. "My grandmother left it to me 3 years ago. I have the keys. I spent my childhood summers here." His expression didn't change. It didn't need to. "We've confirmed this with the county, utility providers, and postal records. Arthur Quo lived here alone until 1973. After that, the house sat legally empty. No electricity, no water, no mail." 50 years of silence. The words settled slowly, like dirt falling back into a grave. And Iris understood then, not just that the garden had been lying to her, but that her past might have been planted just as carefully as the bodies beneath her feet. "No utilities, no deliveries, no signs of occupancy," the detective said quietly. "Every official record agrees no one has lived here since Arthur Quo died." The words landed one after another, heavy and unforgiving. Each sentence cracked something inside her, until the shape of her life no longer held. The porch seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Iris grabbed the iron railing, its cold biting into her palm just to stay upright. Nothing made sense anymore. She searched for arguments, for proof, for anger, but her mind betrayed her. Instead, questions rose uninvited. Where were the photographs? She had never questioned their absence before. Now it screamed at her. No wedding portraits, no childhood pictures, no frozen smiles from birthdays or holidays. Nothing that said we were a family. And her parents? When was the last time she had spoken to them? The memory slid away when she reached for it. She recalled suitcases, business trips, being dropped at the house on Elm Street each summer. But the edges were soft, unreal, like scenes borrowed from someone else's dream. Phone calls, letters, any proof they existed beyond her assumption that they did. "I don't understand what's happening," she murmured. For the first time, Detective Hayes looked less like an official and more like a man facing something he didn't like. "We'll sort this out," he said. "But for now, you shouldn't stay here. This place is going to be examined for a long time." She nodded without truly hearing him. Her attention drifted back to the garden. Under the stark lights, shadows stretched unnaturally between the beds. For a heartbeat, she was certain she saw someone standing there, a tall figure, slightly bent, observing the chaos with calm familiarity, the way he used to. She blinked. The garden was empty. Only darkness, machinery, and voices calmly recording the unearthing of decades of violence. The hotel room later felt unreal, too clean, too temporary, like a place meant for people passing through, not someone trying to remember who she was. Iris sat on the edge of the bed, laptop balanced on her knees, searching for Arthur Quo. There was almost nothing. A quiet man, kept to himself, known only for his garden, no relatives, no friends, no one left alive who could explain why she remembered laughter in his kitchen or summer mornings among the roses. Then the news reports began to surface. Early leaks from the medical examiner described a pattern, deliberate, methodical killings stretched across 30 years. The victims shared one trait. They were easy to erase. Drifters. People no one chased too hard when they vanished. And as Iris stared at the glowing screen, one thought pressed closer than the rest. If Arthur Quo had lived alone, if the house had been empty for 50 years, then whose memories had she been living inside? They had died quietly. No struggle, no chaos. Each life ended with precision, then placed beneath the earth in exact measurements, spaced like rows of crops. The ground around every burial showed signs of deliberate care, turned, fed, nurtured, until it was impossible to ignore the truth. To him, the bodies were never bodies. They were nourishment. Iris shut the laptop and pressed her hands hard against her face, as if she could squeeze logic back into the world. Her memories burned behind her eyes, clear, rich, undeniable. Summers in that house, warm dinners, gentle guidance, a grandfather who laughed softly when she pleased him. 50 years of emptiness, they said. Either her mind was breaking or reality was. Her phone vibrated. A single message from a number she didn't recognize. "The garden needs tending." The words seemed alive, breathing against the glass. Iris didn't reply. She grabbed her keys. She drove back to Elm Street one last time. The police tape was gone. The search was over. The house stood hollow beneath the moon, windows dark and vacant, no longer pretending to be lived in. The garden, stripped of its impossible vitality, was unraveling. Roses sagged, petals scattered. Beds lay bare, nothing but ordinary soil exposed to the night air. For the first time, it looked honest. He was waiting near the broken compost bins, exactly where she knew he would be. "You came back," he said, his tone warm, approving, unchanged. Her voice cracked. "None of this makes sense. They say you're Arthur Quo. They say you murdered 23 people. They say I'm not your granddaughter. They say this place has been empty my whole life." She swallowed. "But I remember everything." He listened calmly, like a teacher allowing a student to finish. "Memory," he said gently, "is a garden of its own. Left alone, it grows wild. Guided carefully, it becomes something beautiful." Her chest tightened. "What does that mean?" He stepped closer, eyes kind, hands relaxed. "It means I raised you the way I raised my roses. I fed you the right stories, removed distractions, trimmed away truths that would stunt your growth." His smile deepened, proud and possessive. "You are my greatest work." The realization struck her with brutal force. She had never inherited the garden. She was part of it. She stumbled back as the truth crashed over her, sharp and undeniable. So I'm not real. He shook his head gently, almost tender. You're as real as the garden ever was, as real as memory, as real as love, as real as the stories people cling to so the world makes sense. He stepped closer. The scent reached her before his words: smoke, soil, something old and damp, comforting once, now unbearable. I shaped you from loneliness, he said softly, from desire, from the strength released when lives end and return to the earth. You are what remains of them, my legacy. His eyes gleamed with the same eager warmth she remembered from childhood lessons, when he spoke of roots and spores and unseen systems beneath the soil. Nothing is wasted. Every garden needs nourishment. I only learned how to turn loss into beauty. Her feet kept retreating, though nowhere felt far enough. If she was built from his need, if her breath, her thoughts, her memories were sustained by what lay buried, then what happened now? The garden was dying. The ground was ordinary again. He answered before she spoke. You can't leave. Without the garden, without me, you'll fade, like a flower severed from its roots. A strange calm passed through her. Maybe that's better. His face tightened, wounded. Don't say that. I gave you everything. Warmth, belonging, a family. I made you whole. You made me from death. I made you from love, he insisted, unwavering. Every life I took was given meaning through you. They should be honored to have become something so perfect. And then, as the world began to thin around her, she felt them. Not as nutrients, not as energy, as people. Moments flashed, cold air biting skin, footsteps on gravel, the soft curl of smoke on the wind. A calm voice offering reassurance. Don't be afraid. Hands guiding them forward. Earth closing in, heavy and final. She understood how easily kindness had opened the door. I remember, she whispered, her voice dissolving into the night. Names surfaced, clear, deliberate, each one spoken like a candle lit in defiance. Ruth, Frank, Caroline, David. One by one, she gave them back their humanity. They gathered close, no longer transformed into beauty, no longer buried beneath lies. Just present, seen, mourned at last. And as Iris unraveled, becoming quiet and formless, what remained was not a garden, not a legacy, but the simple, terrible truth of lives finally acknowledged. And then only stillness remained, the plain, unremarkable quiet of a winter garden, lying fallow between one ending and whatever the next season would choose to bring. Story 2, The Scent That Knows Your Name. The mirror had turned against Isabella. It caught her without mercy, a cold sheet of truth pretending to be glass. In the honeyed glow of late afternoon, she stood motionless, studying the woman staring back. Not the one she remembered, but the one time had quietly rewritten while she slept. Her fingertips followed the unfamiliar borders of her face, the faint etchings at her temples, branching like dry river veins, the softened line of her jaw, once sharp, once decisive, the slow surrender of her neck, folding gently toward age. Each mark felt like a year taken without permission. At 53, she was still striking. Isabella knew this the way only someone who had built a life on beauty could know it, clinically, precisely. She understood the invisible thresholds, when extraordinary slips into admirable, when admirable begins its quiet drift toward being overlooked. Handsome, they called women like her now, a word offered like mercy. Isabella Valdez had never lived on mercy. Laughter floated up through the atelier window, blurred by frosted glass. A man's voice, warm, confident, woven effortlessly with a younger woman's bright delight. Javier, Cellini. Isabella's reflection hardened. Her jaw set around a feeling she refused to name. 24. Fresh from Versailles, perfume school brilliance still clinging to her like dew, Cellini had arrived eager, reverent, wide-eyed, the perfect apprentice. Isabella had taken her in, taught her everything. Not formulas, not recipes, but instinct. The hidden grammar of scent. How bergamot should greet the skin like a promise. How jasmine should linger like a confession whispered too close. She had opened her sanctuary, shared her legacy. Now Cellini wore that knowledge openly, effortlessly, like jewels never meant for her fingers. Isabella pressed her hand to the glass, leaving pale marks that looked almost accusatory. 3 floors below, in the courtyard garden, Javier guided Cellini through a lesson Isabella herself had created decades ago, identifying roses by scent alone. No touch, no bruising the petals, just patience. He held Cellini's wrist with the same careful precision he once used on Isabella, fingers hovering, teaching restraint, teaching reverence. Isabella remembered that moment vividly. The electricity of his skin near hers, the way his breath had warmed her ear as he spoke softly, confidently, as if scent itself listened when he spoke. The past didn't knock. It leaned in close and breath. He spoke the names softly, reverently, as if each one were a prayer. Mr. Lincoln, Black Magic, Double Delight. Isabella remembered hearing those names for the first time when she was 19, standing barefoot behind her grandmother's spice counter in Buenos Aires. Back then, scent came to her like color to a painter, immediate, overwhelming, impossible to explain. She could feel aromas before she understood them. Cardamom bloomed like heat behind her eyes. Star anise curled dark and sweet along her spine. She had no language for it, only instinct. Javier had been 30 when he walked into that shop, confident in the quiet way of men who no longer question themselves. He paused the moment the air shifted around her, as if the room itself had whispered her name. An hour later, he was asking questions. By the end of the week, he was persuading her grandmother that Paris was not danger but destiny. Within a year, Isabella was no longer raw brilliance. She was refined fire. They had built everything together after that. 34 years entwined across every boundary. Lovers, collaborators, architects of desire. Their signature fragrance, Medianoche, was released sparingly, coveted obsessively. Isabella had designed it to capture that exact second when daylight surrenders, when the world exhales and becomes honest. It made them legends in an industry where immortality was measured in molecules and memory. The bell above the atelier door rang, thin and precise, like the opening note of a requiem. Isabella turned away from the window and smoothed her silk blouse, arranging her face into the expression the world expected, the one that still commanded rooms, beauty, carefully preserved, curated now like everything else. The woman who entered was unfamiliar, and that alone unsettled her. She was around 40, maybe older, with a severity that didn't resist time but sharpened with it. Silver white hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin into sculpture. Black wool impeccably cut, power worn quietly. Her eyes were pale, glacial blue, the kind that observed rather than judged. Madame Valdez, the woman said. Her accent slipped between places, educated everywhere, rooted nowhere. My name is Ayler Balma, and I believe you are searching for renewal. Isabella's fingers rose instinctively to her throat, brushing the pulse point where she wore her perfume every day. Medianoche bloomed faintly in response, smoke, shadow, longing. I don't recall requesting an appointment, Isabella said coolly. Ayler smiled just barely. People rarely do, not consciously. Her gaze drifted through the room, lingering on the shelves of rare absolutes, the locked cabinets, the handwritten formula notebooks. Then finally back to Isabella's face. "You're standing at the threshold," Aylar continued. "The moment where influence fades before relevance does, where the mirror becomes unkind, where proteges begin to replace their masters." Isabella felt something tighten in her chest. "I don't sell cosmetics," she said. "I create fragrance." Aylar stepped closer. "I don't offer cosmetics, I offer continuation." Silence stretched between them, dense and fragrant. Outside, laughter rose again from the courtyard, young, effortless, unburdened. Isabella closed her eyes for just a moment. And in that instant, she understood exactly how far she was willing to go to never be forgotten. The morning light had barely warmed the atelier when the woman's words cut through the quiet like steel. Precise, knowing. It was as if she had been tracing Isabella's every misstep, every moment where control had slipped from some unseen vantage point. "I'm sorry," Isabella said, voice calm, professional. "Do we have an appointment?" The woman's smile was thin, sharp, a blade hidden in elegance. "Your assistant left early," she said. "Yes, I know. Young love makes one careless with schedules. Celine seems quite enchanted with her mentor, no." The comment landed with the subtle brutality of cold wind. Isabella's chest tightened, cheeks burning with the twin fires of embarrassment and fury. Someone had been watching them, studying their private moments, drawing conclusions from fragments of their lives. "I've come from the earth itself," the stranger continued, stepping into the atelier with the confidence of someone who had mastered sacred spaces. "I work with materials that bloom only under rare, specific conditions, circumstances most would call impossible." She paused at Isabella's blending table. Hundreds of small glass bottles caught the afternoon light, each one a captured sunbeam. Rose petals from Bulgaria, jasmine from Egypt, sandalwood from India. Decades of cultivation, relationships nurtured with growers across the globe. The woman inhaled slowly, eyes half closed, savoring the invisible music of scent that danced in the air. Bergamot from Calabria, ylang ylang from the Comoros, patchouli from Indonesia. Every element perfect, every note precise. "And yet," she said finally, almost softly, "something is missing, isn't it? The spark, the soul that made Medianoche sing on the skin like a siren's call. Tell me, Madame Valdez, when did you lose it?" The question struck like a scalpel, slicing straight to the core of Isabella's fear. Heat rose to her cheeks. The carefully constructed mask of professionalism she wore cracked along fault lines she had prayed no one could see. "I haven't lost anything," she said, voice quick, defensive, too sharp. The woman's gaze didn't waver. "Competence," she said, cool, measured, "is not genius. Your work, technically perfect, commercially viable, is still only the shadow of what you once commanded. Genius, once departed, rarely returns on its own." She pivoted, moving with the fluid authority of someone who owned not just the room but the air itself. Her pale eyes locked on Isabella's, drilling deep into the soul of a woman who suddenly felt both exposed and electrified, aware that this visitor had arrived not merely to advise, but to see, to measure, to awaken. The room seemed to shrink around her, the air thick with the weight of unspoken judgments. Ara's gaze lingered, cold and precise, as if she were reading the map of Isabella's soul, tracing every hesitation, every flicker of doubt. "I can smell it on you," she said, voice dropping to a near whisper, desperation. "Sharp, metallic, bitter like burnt hair or the copper of old coins, unbecoming for a woman who should know better." The words cut, surgical in their accuracy, and Isabella's instinct screamed at her to resist, to reclaim the authority she had built over decades. Yet, despite herself, she felt the pull, a current of dangerous fascination, like standing on the edge of a cliff where the wind promises both ruin and exhilaration. "What exactly are you offering?" Her own voice sounded distant, fragile, almost unfamiliar. Ara moved slowly, deliberately, each motion a ritual. From her black leather bag, she produced a tiny vial no larger than Isabella's thumb. Its contents glowed like liquid amber, alive, writhing with a rhythm that seemed independent of gravity or time. "Essence blooms," Ara said, holding the vial to the light. Sunbeams fractured across its surface, spilling gold across her pale, flawless face. "These flowers," she continued, "grow only in the rarest conditions. They feed on what ordinary plants cannot: regret, sorrow, the quiet despair of a life slipping away unseen." Isabella felt herself leaning forward despite every caution, drawn to the hypnotic cadence of Ara's voice, to the way the liquid seemed to call directly to her. "They distill truth into sin," Ara said, eyes locked on hers. "Not the sanitized truths we tell ourselves, but the raw, unfiltered essence of who we are." She paused, letting the words hang like smoke in the air. "Wear this for 30 days and the world will find you irresistible. But beware, Madame Truth is a dangerous perfume. It surfaces when least expected. It unmasks the things we hide, the things we bury even from ourselves." Isabella's fingers trembled as she reached for the vial. The glass was warm, almost alive, pulsing faintly in her hand. The fragrance that escaped was like nothing she had ever catalogued. Floral, yes, but deeper, richer, with layers of earth, shadow, and something compellingly alive. Something that whispered promises she was both terrified and desperate to hear. Something deep inside her stirred, a memory of self she'd long forgotten, whispering through the edges of her consciousness. And the price? Her voice was quieter than she intended, almost afraid of the answer. She already knew it wouldn't be measured in coins or bills. "We'll discuss payment once you witness the results," Ara said, gliding toward the door with the effortless command of someone who always left an impression. "One spray each morning behind the ears at the pulse points. No more, no less. The blooms respond only to precision." She paused at the threshold, fingers brushing the handle, and for a fleeting heartbeat, her expression softened into something resembling pity. "Be certain, Madame Valdez. Some kinds of beauty claim debts you can never repay. Some doors, once opened, never close again." The bell chimed softly as she departed, leaving Isabella alone in her atelier, the vial of essence blooms cradled in her hands. The amber liquid swirled like molten sunlight trapped in glass. Outside, Javier and Celine's laughter floated back, intimate, private, the sound of shared discovery. Isabella turned toward her reflection, scrutinizing the woman in the mirror, the woman who had once been radiant, now only handsome, once genius, now merely competent. With a deep breath, she uncapped the vial. The scent was a challenge and a promise, a distilled whisper of transformation and unvarnished truth. She inhaled deeply, letting it sink into her skin, into her memory, into the spaces where doubt had lived too long. The change was imperceptible at first, subtle as the earliest light of dawn brushing a winter sky. By the third morning, after applying the perfume for the third time, she stood before the bathroom mirror and felt it, something uncanny. Her reflection lingered a fraction longer than it should have, as if the glass itself struggled to keep pace with her body. She blinked, turned, and caught the mirrored image mid-motion. Her spine tingled. The skin staring back at her was flawless, not younger, not artificial. but impossibly perfect, as if porcelain had been laid over her bones. Tiny scars, a faded beauty mark, all the marks that had given her face character, now softened, muted, like shadows through a veil of delicate glass. Leaning closer, Isabella studied herself with the scrutiny of a woman who had spent decades dissecting beauty, analyzing every contour for potential and flaw alike. The subtle layers of makeup she had so carefully applied, foundation, concealer, powders, had vanished from her reflection. Her own artistry seemed unnecessary. Something more potent had begun its work. The shadows beneath her eyes never appeared. Instead, her skin glowed softly, as if lit from somewhere beneath the surface, an inner radiance that felt unearned, almost unholy. She touched her cheek, tracing the familiar map of her face. Warm, supple, real. And yet, in the mirror, her reflection smiled a heartbeat before she did, like it knew what she was about to become. By the end of the first week, denial was no longer possible. The fine lines around her eyes hadn't faded, they were erased. What remained was skin so smooth, so perfectly balanced, it bordered on imitation. Even her body remembered its past. Her spine straightened, shoulders drawing back into the quiet authority she'd worn effortlessly in her 20s. Passing the atelier window, she caught her reflection and felt a jolt. This woman belonged behind glass, framed and preserved, not walking the street. But it was the small disturbances that unsettled her most. The fern in the atelier began to die despite careful tending, its fronds curling inward as though shrinking from an invisible poison. The stray cat that once basked in the courtyard now bolted at the sight of her, fur bristling, eyes wild, prey sensing a hunter it couldn't see. And then Javier noticed. It began with looks that lingered too long. His gaze tracked her movements with an intensity she hadn't felt in months. During morning reviews, she caught him staring at her hands, her throat, the way light slid across her hair. It wasn't the familiar affection of 34 years. It was sharper, needier, laced with something dangerously close to fear. "You look different," he said one evening over wine in their apartment above the atelier. His voice held a note of unease he didn't recognize himself. "It's like you've been repainted." She set down her glass, studying him. Different how? Younger, yes, but more than that. He leaned closer, inhaling slowly as if chasing a scent just beyond memory. Perfect, too perfect, like a retouched photograph. Beautiful, but not quite real. She laughed, surprised by how rich and musical the sound had become. "Are you complaining about my appearance, darling?" "No, no," he said quickly, then hesitated, confusion knitting his brow. "I don't know, there's something about you now, something pulling at me. I think about you constantly." His voice dropped. "Even when I'm with." He stopped himself, color blooming across his face, as though he'd nearly confessed to something he didn't yet understand. "Even when you're with Sela," Isabella finished, her voice low, honeyed, deliberate. Javier's face went pale, eyes widening. "Isabella, It's quite all right," she interrupted softly, rising from her chair and moving behind him. Her hands settled on his shoulders, warm, insistent, feeling the tension in his muscles, the way he shivered at her touch. Young attraction was ephemeral, meaningless, but natural. She leaned close, whispering into his ear, and caught her reflection in the window. For a heartbeat, it looked predatory, wide-eyed, sharp, like a hunter poised over prey. Then the image softened, revealing a woman reclaiming what was hers, radiating authority and inevitability. "But you must remember," she murmured, her breath grazing his skin, "what we've built, what we mean to each other. Some bonds run deeper than mere desire." That night, for the first time in 6 months, Javier joined her in bed, and the old rhythm of connection returned. tinged with something electric and new. The next morning, Isabella performed the ritual with reverent precision. The essence bloom perfume, each delicate spray a baptism, a renewal of a pact she barely understood but fully owned. The scent wove into her being, indistinguishable from her own skin, her own presence. In the atelier, she worked on a new creation she called resurrection. Each measured drop of bergamot, jasmine, and rare blooms became a note in a symphony of reinvention. She hummed a wordless melody as she worked, a vibration that seemed to make the air itself shimmer with possibility. Celine arrived late, hesitant, her youth suddenly fragile against Isabella's commanding presence. She moved through her tasks with distracted efficiency, stealing glances at Isabella whenever she thought she wasn't noticed. "Celine," Isabella said softly without looking up, "is something troubling you, darling?" The girl approached, hands twisting nervously. "Madame Valdez, I wanted to ask you something." "Of course, about Javier, our sessions." Celine's voice dropped, tremulous. "He seems different lately, distant. Did I do something wrong?" Isabella finally lifted her gaze, studying the girl's anxious, diminutive frame. Youth alone was currency only when unchallenged. Here, in the presence of experience, confidence, and the quiet, potent magic coursing through Isabella, freshness seemed almost insignificant, fragile and fleeting against the power of what had been carefully cultivated over decades. "Men are complicated creatures, my dear," Isabella murmured, her voice smooth, edged with sympathy that didn't quite touch her eyes. "Their focus drifts, often to things they barely understand themselves." Celine's expression faltered, the proud facade slipping for a fraction of a second. Isabella observed without a flicker of guilt, only the detached satisfaction of someone watching a carefully designed experiment unfold perfectly. "I thought," Celine hesitated, biting back the words. "You thought what, darling?" Isabella prompted, a faint smile curling at the edges of her lips. "That he cared about me, my ideas, my potential. He said I reminded him of someone he once knew." Isabella's smile widened, sharp, precise, almost predatory in its perfection. "I'm sure you do. The question is whether that's fortunate or dangerous. Men who chase shadows of memory rarely find reality waiting neatly for them." Celine blinked rapidly, holding back tears with the stubborn pride of youth, still too inexperienced to recognize defeat. "I should get back to work," the girl whispered. "Yes," Isabella said softly, turning back to her blending with renewed purpose. "You should." As Celine retreated, Isabella inhaled deeply, letting the heady mix of bergamot and jasmine fill her lungs. But there was something more beneath it, a scent she alone could detect. Victory, power reclaimed, the exquisite, intoxicating taste of a battle won that had seemed impossible from the start. That evening before dinner, Isabella sprayed essence bloom across her pulse points, pausing in front of the mirror. Her reflection was breathtaking, more striking than any she had been in her 20s. Yet the eyes gave her pause. Behind their brilliance flickered something alive, something clever, something that smiled with too many teeth, a hunger that had nothing to do with love or desire, only with conquest. The flash disappeared, leaving only Isabella Valdez, radiant, renewed, victorious, ready to seize everything she had ever earned. The dinner party was her idea, though she presented it as if it had been a shared inspiration. 20 of Paris's most influential figures in perfumery gathered in the restored 19th century apartment, the air thick with anticipation. Tonight, Isabella would unveil resurrection, the fragrance that would reclaim her throne, reassert her legend, and remind the world why Isabella Valdez was the city's premier nose. She dressed as if preparing for battle, every detail calculated. The black dress hugged her in all the right places, a new acquisition from a boutique in Saintan, where a young salesgirl had stared in awe and asked if she were a model. Her hair spilled in dark waves that caught the light like liquid night, and her skin seemed to glow from within, but it was the scent that made her unstoppable. 3 weeks of ritual application had transformed Essence Bloom from mere perfume into an invisible armor, a herald that announced her arrival before she even stepped into the room, and a lingering promise that stayed long after she passed. The guests trickled in, their chatter and the gentle clink of crystal filling the apartment with warmth and expectation. Isabella moved among them with effortless authority, a prow cutting through the tide, graciously deflecting compliments while cataloging every glance, every pause in conversation as she passed. Isabella, absolutely radiant tonight, Margaret Chanel said, the critic whose word could make or break a launch. What's your secret? You've never looked so alive. Clean living and fine wine, Isabella replied lightly, raising her glass. Heads turned instinctively, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Laurent, Javier's business partner, was the first to comment. Standing near the windows that opened onto the private garden, he spoke softly. There's something unusual tonight, a scent, almost unsettling, like flowers left too long in water. Other guests began to notice. Conversations dipped to hushed tones, the atmosphere tightening as if the perfume itself were pressing them closer together. The carefully curated fragrance of resurrection, combined with the essence bloom now woven into Isabella's skin, began to take on a life of its own, something richer, darker, more compelling than she had intended. It's like secrets, Anton Marrow said, voice low, almost reverent. The elderly perfumer, Isabella's first mentor, tilted his head as though inhaling hidden histories, the kind that cling to old letters, forgotten photographs, the things we hide in drawers and hope no one finds. Isabella laughed, but the sound pitched higher than she intended, a fragile note of surprise and unease. Poetic, Anton, or perhaps just too much champagne, she said. Yet even as she spoke, she felt it, the undertone beneath the orchestrated perfection of the evening, subtle at first, brushing against her skin and sinking into her chest like a warning. Something in the air had shifted, something alive, waiting and aware. The fragrance wove through the room so completely it was almost impossible to tell if it was real or imagined. But as the evening deepened, as the champagne flowed and laughter loosened, the scent shifted, no longer delicate, no longer just flowers. It became something darker, like blossoms steeped in shadow, beautiful yet rotten beneath the surface, sweet yet deadly. And with it came compulsion, not the kind born of drink, but something far deeper, more primal, a need to speak, to confess, to lay bare what had been buried within. Margaret clutched her throat, eyes wide and glistening as her words tumbled out, raw and jagged. I fabricate sources, half my reviews fake interviews. Her voice cracked like brittle glass, each syllable a confession she couldn't stop. Laurent trembled beside her, his tailored suit slick with sweat. Each word he spoke wrung from him as if his own body resisted. I had an affair with my son's wife. Tears streamed down his face, his confession like fire crawling up his throat. She looks just like my first love. Even Javier, steady and composed for decades, faltered. Standing near the fireplace, arm around Isabella, his face paled as words clawed their way out, unstoppable. I left my first wife for Isabella, he admitted, voice raw, eyes desperate, as if confessing might save him or destroy him. She was pregnant. I have a daughter, her name is Alara. The room fell into stunned silence. Ripples of shock passed through the guests, each grappling with revelations they hadn't imagined hearing. Isabella felt her stomach drop, her chest tighten. 34 years together, and Javier had never hinted at this, never spoken of a wife, never mentioned a child. And I named her Lara, he added, swaying slightly. Carmen wrote to me once, when she was 15, sent a photograph. I burned it, threw it away. Some doors are better left closed. The name struck Isabella like a blow. Lara, Alara, the same silver-haired woman who had delivered the Essence Bloom perfume, who had whispered warnings about truth and its cost. Around the room, the guests could no longer hold back. Secrets spilled from them like wine from a broken bottle. Financial deceit, hidden betrayals, addictions buried under years of civility. Every confession thickened the air. And beneath it all, that scent lingered, impossible and intoxicating. Flowers blooming in darkness, beauty entwined with decay, irresistible yet horrifying. The evening had transformed into something unrecognizable, a living symphony of truth, perfume, and confession. And Isabella, at the center, inhaled deeply, knowing the power she now wielded was as dangerous as it was intoxicating. Isabella pressed her trembling hands to her throat, feeling her pulse hammer against her fingertips. The perfume she'd applied that morning throbbed in time with her heartbeat, almost alive, as if it had grown its own consciousness on her skin. What's happening?" she whispered, but her voice was drowned beneath the chorus of uncontrollable confessions echoing through the apartment. And then she saw her, emerging from the doorway like a vision from a fevered dream. Ara, immaculate in her severe black attire, her pale eyes calculating and cold, drinking in the chaos with the precision of a scientist observing an experiment. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, Selene, the young apprentice, her face streaked with tears of comprehension, watched silently. "Hello, Isabella," Ara's voice rang clear across the stunned room. "I believe it is time we had a proper introduction. I am Valdez. Though I have carried my mother's maiden name professionally, I suspect you knew my father quite well." The apartment was almost empty now. Guests had fled, their confessions spilling forth like a torrent, leaving abandoned wine glasses and unfinished conversations in their wake. Secrets lingered in the air, thick and almost visible, like smoke from a fire snuffed too soon. Only 4 remained. Isabella, frozen in the epicenter of her own triumph-earned ruin. Javier, slumped in his chair, hands buried in his face. Selene, wide-eyed by the window. And Ara, moving with the confidence of someone reclaiming what was always hers. You are not real," Isabella breathed. Words barely more than a whisper, yet even as they left her lips, she knew they were false. The resemblance was undeniable now. The same strong jaw, the way the shoulders held themselves, the dark eyes that seemed to pierce through everything and everyone. "I assure you I am very real," Ara said, lifting one of Isabella's own bottles to the light, letting the amber liquid catch and bend the afternoon glow. "Bergamot from Calabria, superb quality. You always had exquisite taste, Isabella, even if your methods left something to be desired." Javier lifted his head slowly, the color draining from his face as dawning realization spread across him. "Ara, but you can't. You're your daughter." "Yes," she said, voice sharp as a scalpel, "and I rather think I can." She set the bottle down with meticulous precision, each movement deliberate, rehearsed. "Carmen raised me to know you, Javier. Every clipping, every article, every accolade about the great perfumer and his talented partner. I memorized it all. She ensured I understood why you never returned, why the legacy remained, and why it needed completing. Isabella found her voice, a thin tremor cutting through the thick tension. How long have you been planning this? Years, Ara said, smiling. A smile so cold, so precise, it cut sharper than any knife. Did you think it was mere coincidence that Selene came to your door? Ara's voice cut through the thick silence like a scalpel. That such a promising young apprentice would choose a house whose reputation had begun to fade. Selene stepped forward, her face flushed, eyes lowered, a mix of embarrassment and something that might have been pity. Isabella, I'm so sorry, I never meant. She approached me at the perfumery school, Ara continued, voice smooth as silk yet edged with steel. Said she was researching the old masters, wanted to understand how Carmen Valdez's techniques had shaped modern perfumery. She offered to fund my advanced studies if I could get close enough to observe your methods. Selene's voice dropped to a whisper. She said Carmen was her grandmother, that she needed to know what had really happened between you. I thought it was just academic research. What stories? Isabella demanded, her voice rising, the anger she'd been suppressing igniting like wildfire. About how you seduced my father away from his pregnant wife. About building your career on stolen formulas, Carmen's family recipes, claimed as your own innovations. About Medinina, your famous signature scent, created by the woman you destroyed. Ara moved closer. With each step, the scent of essence bloom grew stronger, curling around Isabella like a living thing. Carmen died 5 years ago, Ara said quietly. Cancer. She spent her final months making me promise that someday, somehow, you would face the truth of what you'd done. The room seemed to tilt beneath Isabella. The landscape of her life, the one she thought she knew, rearranged itself into unfamiliar territory. She thought of Medellin, the perfume that had built her empire, and remembered the long nights in Buenos Aires, Javier disappearing for hours and returning with pages of notes in a delicate feminine hand he insisted belonged to a local consultant. You're lying, she said, but the words rang hollow even to her own ears. The essence blooms don't lie, Isabella, Ara replied. They cannot. They are extraordinary flowers. They grow only where great suffering has occurred, where truths have been buried so deep they begin to ferment. They feed on secrets, transforming them into something beautiful and terrible. Ara reached into her bag and withdrew another vial, this one filled with liquid so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it. This, she said, holding it up to the lamplight, is what happens when the blooms are allowed to mature fully, when every hidden truth has been extracted and concentrated. Inside the darkness of the vial, Isabella could see shapes moving, swirling. Petals, shadows, something else entirely, alive and writhing, as if the secrets themselves had taken form. One more application, Ara said, her voice low and deliberate, and the process will be complete. The perfume will have absorbed everything you've hidden, every lie, every deception. Then the world will know, not through confession, Isabella. That was only the beginning. Through scent. Every room you enter, every person who draws near enough to breathe you in, they will smell your secrets. Your lies will become your signature fragrance. Isabella stumbled backward but found herself following, uncapping the vial despite the terror clawing at her chest. The scent rose, thick and alive, flowers blooming in graveyards, beauty rooted in rot, truth distilled into something intoxicating and unbearable. Don't, she gasped. But her body betrayed her. She leaned closer, drawn to the dark allure, addicted to the very thing that would undo her. You made your choice the moment you accepted my gift, Ara said, calm, almost tender. Some transformations cannot be undone. With a flick of her wrist, the liquid dispersed into a fine mist, settling over Isabella like a veil. It kissed her skin, and she felt fire crawling beneath her flesh, acid, heat, the burn of revelation. But when she looked, her skin remained flawless, untouched. The change was not on the surface. It was deeper. Her secrets rose one by one from the recesses of her mind, twisting and turning until they became scent, clinging to her like a second skin. Every betrayal, every stolen moment, every lie she had hidden from the world, it all became hers to carry, impossible to conceal. She staggered to the mirror. The woman who stared back was still radiant, young, beautiful, irresistible. Yet beneath the surface, Isabella saw it. The rot beneath the rose, the worm in the apple. The truth now radiated from her in invisible waves, impossible to mask, impossible to deny. Behind her, Javier wept, silent and broken, mourning not only the daughter he had abandoned, but the woman he had thought he knew. Selene stood beside him, her young face bearing wisdom far beyond her years, eyes wide with comprehension. And there across the room, Ara watched, cold, perfect, terrible, like winter moonlight glinting off fresh snow, satisfaction etched in every line of her face. 3 months had passed since the dinner party, though to Isabella it felt like an eternity. The transformation had settled into her bones like a shadow she could neither shake nor ignore. She remained beautiful, perhaps more beautiful than ever, but the radiance now carried weight, power, fear, truth. Her beauty had become corrupted, tainted by the aromatic revelation of her secrets. The apartment on Saint Germain lay empty now, windows shuttered and dust-laden, a monument to the life she had once controlled. Javier had departed for Buenos Aires, taking Selene with him, not as a lover, Isabella realized now, but as the daughter he had never had. They went to visit Carmen's grave, to honor her memory and perhaps salvage a fragment of peace. Before leaving, Javier had divided their shared assets with meticulous care, leaving Isabella wealthy, yet utterly alone. She tried to continue her work, renting a small studio in Matra where she could practice her craft unseen. But the essence blooms had changed everything. Every perfume she created carried the undertone of her sins. Stolen formulas, broken promises, carefully orchestrated seductions that had built her empire. Potential clients would sample her work and recoil, a deep, unarticulated revulsion twisting their features. Something in the sense betrayed her, something primal and instinctive. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit world of Parisian perfumery. People whispered about Isabella's fall, but none could name it. They only knew she had become something else, something that made children scream as she passed, that caused strangers to gag and recoil from the mere trace of her presence. Isabella learned to read the terror in their eyes, the pale faces of former colleagues, the involuntary flinch as they caught the faint notes of ink, mildewed paper, and the creative essence of women whose work she had stolen. Strangers on the metro doubled over, clutching their stomachs, repelled by the metallic bite of calculated seduction. The bitter tang of ambition sharpened into something almost poisonous. A mother once tried to sit near her in a cafe. Her child wailed uncontrollably, pointing with raw, instinctive fear, and the woman fled with the girl, abandoning coffee and conversation alike. Isabella understood then. Her very presence had become a weapon. She learned to move like a shadow. Grocery runs in the dead hours of morning. Cafes visited only when the streets were nearly empty. She memorized the routes that allowed her to breathe without leaving devastation in her wake. The city that had once celebrated her genius now recoiled from her existence. And yet she could not stop, for the scent, the essence blooms, had made her a force that could not be hidden, a living signature of every secret she had ever kept. Isabella had learned the rhythms of avoidance. Cafes with outdoor seating, where the wind would carry her scent away from unsuspecting patrons. Parks with isolated benches, paths where she could walk without disturbing couples or families. Paris, the city that had once made her fortune, had become a labyrinth designed to minimize her presence, to protect others from the invisible weapon she carried in her skin. Yet solitude was not the worst punishment. The worst was knowing that somewhere in the city, Ana Lara Valdez was rising, the daughter she had unknowingly wronged, using Carmen's family recipes and her own talent, was building a career Isabella had once envisioned for herself. Critics and collectors hung on her creations. Glowing profiles in Vogue and reviews in Le Figaro celebrated her genius. Isabella's legacy, once untouchable, had been claimed by another. And still, the essence blooms called to her. Each morning she woke with an irresistible compulsion, reaching for the vial as if it were air itself. The perfume had evolved, growing darker, richer, more potent as her secrets fermented into scent. Every movement she made left a trail of confessions, aromatic breadcrumbs of sin that only the sensitive could read. She had tried to destroy it, pouring the remaining liquid down the bathroom drain. But each morning it reappeared on her dressing table, full and taunting, as if her need alone had regenerated it. The essence blooms were a gift that could not be refused. On a gray December afternoon, she walked among the tombs of Père Lachaise Cemetery, the cold air softening her scent and the dense shadows of monuments offering camouflage. She paused at a simple grave, newer than most, fresh flowers arranged at its base. The inscription read, Carmen Valdez, 1952-2020. Beloved mother, her truth lives on. I wondered when you'd come here. Isabella felt a ripple of unease and recognition. She's buried here. Ana Lara emerged from the maze of headstones, dressed in her trademark black wool, carrying a single white rose. Of course, she said softly. I had her moved from Buenos Aires last year. She wanted to rest in Paris. Strange, perhaps, but this was the city of her dreams, before you and my father took them from her. Ara knelt before the grave, carefully replacing the wilted flowers with the fresh white rose she had brought. She used to tell me about the perfume she'd create if she ever made it to France, Ana Lara said softly, her voice carrying across the winter air. Complex, beautiful things that would capture longing itself. Isabella watched the ritual, feeling a strange twist in her chest. Grief, relief, perhaps both. Did she hate her? No. Ana Lara understood better than anyone how easy it was to lose yourself in the pursuit of beauty, to become intoxicated by transformation and forget who you had been before. The two women stood in silence. The winter wind carried the scent of dead leaves and the first drift of snow. For a brief moment, Isabella breathed deeply, tasting air untainted by the aromatic weight she always carried. Will it ever end? She asked, her voice thin. Ana Lara's pale eyes regarded her, depths of sorrow and knowledge locked within them. The curse, the compulsion, the way your secrets trail you like loyal hounds, I don't know. The essence blooms respond to truth, to genuine change. Perhaps if you found a way to make amends. Isabella laughed bitterly. How does one make amends for a lifetime of lies? Very carefully, Ana Lara said, shrugging, and probably too late. She began to walk away, her footsteps muffled by frost and brittle grass. Wait, Isabella's voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. Please, I know I have no right to ask, but what happens now? Do you just leave me like this? Is this enough revenge for you?" Analara paused, her back still turned. Revenge was never the point, Isabella. Understanding was. My mother spent 30 years trying to understand why the woman who stole her life never seemed to suffer while you were famous and beloved, while she raised a daughter alone in exile. She died still wondering if you even remembered her name. "I remember," Isabella whispered, the words sharp in the cold air, carrying the sting of that first stolen truth. "Do you?" Analara turned then, her expression not cruel, but infinitely sad. "Because I think you've spent so long wearing other people's truths as your own that you've forgotten what yours actually smell like. The essence blooms didn't curse you, Isabella. They simply revealed what was always there. And now, everyone can smell exactly what kind of woman you truly are." With that, she walked away, dissolving among the monuments and mausoleums like a ghost seeking her proper grave. Isabella remained kneeling beside Carmen's resting place, snow beginning to fall, settling softly around her. The white flakes, pure and silent, blanketed the city's secrets except for hers. The wind cut through the cemetery like a whispered accusation, rattling the bare branches above. Isabella's fingers clutched the coat around her shoulders as she stepped carefully across frostbitten paths, the soles of her boots crunching in rhythm with her racing thoughts. Every breath drew in the cold, sharp air, carrying the faint, ghostly scent of stone and winter leaves. She knelt for a moment beside the fresh white rose, tracing the delicate curve of its petals with trembling fingers. Each touch reminded her of the debts she had accrued over a lifetime, the stolen triumphs, the hidden betrayals, the brilliance she had claimed at the cost of everything that truly mattered. Here, in the silence between monuments, the weight of it pressed down, relentless and unyielding. Somewhere behind her, a bell tolled, each chime vibrating through the frozen air, counting the hours that had slipped away unnoticed. She adjusted her coat and rose, staring at the shadowed paths stretching into the fog, knowing she would soon return to the emptiness of her apartment. There, on the dressing table, the Essence Bloom perfume waited, a small glass promise of transformation, of power, and of peril. It called to her like a lover who demanded more than devotion. It demanded surrender. Snow swirled around her as she passed through the gates, a delicate storm that blanketed the city in temporary purity. The flakes drifted in silence, each one a fleeting emblem of possibility, untouched by the darkness that thrived in hidden corners of human hearts. And yet, beneath the fragile white surface of the world, she carried her own winter, secrets that had grown into gardens of shadow, blooming eternal and impossible to conceal. Isabella's breath caught as she imagined the path ahead, long lonely, and yet suffused with the strange thrill of awakening. Each step toward the city felt heavier than the last, each one a reminder that she could never unlearn the truths she now carried on her skin, in her blood, in the invisible perfume that announced her story to the world. Somewhere, perhaps, beyond the frost and the gravestones, redemption lingered, but only for those willing to meet it in the raw, unvarnished scent of their own unmasked soul. The night deepened, and Paris lay quiet beneath the snow, unaware of the storm that walked its streets. Isabella, carrying both beauty and ruin, stepping forward into a future she could neither escape nor fully control. And in the swirling cold, the essence of her truth followed her like a shadow, persistent, radiant, and utterly unstoppable.